The C-130 banked hard over the Hindu Kush, its cargo bay rattling with the kind of turbulence that separated tourists from soldiers. Master Sergeant Dakota Reeves sat in the jump seat, watching the loadmaster check straps with mechanical precision. Nobody spoke to her. That was fine. She'd grown accustomed to silence over the past 6 months, ever since Bagram had quietly reassigned her stateside on what the paperwork called administrative leave pending review. The official language was sterile. The reality was messier. Someone had filed a complaint about mission prioritization, about unauthorized deviations, about a single mother making judgment calls that put aircraft at risk. The accusations were vague enough to stick, specific enough to wound. So they'd sent her home to Nebraska, to a reserve unit that flew cargo routes and kept her away from anything that mattered. Her daughter Emma had asked why Mommy wasn't deploying anymore. Dakota told her it was temporary. She wasn't sure she believed it herself. Now, 8 weeks later, she was back, not because anyone had apologized, not because the investigation had cleared her name, but because SEAL Team 7 had refused to fly their next operation without her. The request had come through channels that bypassed normal protocol, signed by a commander whose reputation made colonels nervous. The message was 3 sentences long. It mentioned her call sign. It mentioned a valley. It mentioned a debt. Dakota hadn't seen the full mission brief yet, but she knew the terrain they were heading into. She'd flown it 11 times during her last rotation, threading pave hawks through passes so narrow that rotor wash would kick up dust from both cliff faces simultaneously. The valley had a name the locals used, something that translated to where helicopters go to die. American forces called it the Gauntlet. 60 miles of canyon system, too tight for fixed-wing support, crawling with overwatch positions that could track aircraft from ridgeline to ridgeline. Most pilots avoided it. Dakota had made it her specialty. The C-130's engines changed pitch, beginning their descent into Jalalabad. Through the porthole window, she could see the mountains rising like broken teeth against a sky the color of old bruises. Somewhere down there, a SEAL team was waiting. They'd asked for her specifically, by name and call sign. That meant something. It also meant someone had overruled the administrative hold on her record, pulled strings she didn't know existed, and put her back in rotation despite whatever complaints had sidelined her. The question that had haunted her through 2 connecting flights and 11 hours of travel remained unanswered. Why her? What made this mission different? And what exactly had she done in that valley that made men who specialized in impossible operations refuse to go back without her? The fob at Jalalabad smelled like diesel fuel and burning trash, a combination that hit Dakota's sinuses the moment she stepped off the C-130's ramp. The air was different here than Nebraska, thinner, sharper, carrying the weight of a war that had ground on longer than some of the soldiers fighting it. She shouldered her kit bag and headed toward the operations building, a plywood structure that looked like it had been assembled by someone who'd learned construction from YouTube videos. Inside, the air conditioning was losing a battle against the afternoon heat. A captain she didn't recognize glanced up from a laptop, took in her flight suit and the master sergeant stripes on her shoulder, and went back to his screen without comment. Dakota had seen that look before. The careful neutrality of someone who'd heard the rumors but didn't know which version to believe. She found the briefing room by following the sound of voices, low, controlled, the kind of professional murmur that meant operators were talking through contingencies. When she pushed through the door, the conversation stopped. 6 men looked up from a topographical map spread across a plywood table. They wore civilian clothes, the kind of anonymous tactical gear that screamed quiet professional. No name tapes, no rank, no unit insignia. But the oldest one, a man in his early 40s with a beard that had gone gray at the temples, smiled when he saw her. "Widow," he said, using her call sign like a greeting. It was Lieutenant Commander James Dalton, though she'd never heard anyone use his rank. Everyone called him Dal. "Heard you were flying cargo in the heartland." "Heard you were retired," Dakota replied. His smile widened. "We both heard wrong." The other 5 SEALs maintained their professional stillness, but she caught the subtle relaxation in their postures. These men knew her or knew of her. That changed the temperature in the room. Dahl gestured to the map. You remember the gauntlet? Every meter, Dakota said. Good, because we're going back, and this time we're going deeper. He tapped a point on the map, a tributary valley that branched off the main canyon system. Dakota felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd flown past that valley 11 times, marked it as a no-fly zone in her personal navigation logs. The approaches were suicidal, barely wide enough for a Black Hawk's rotor span, elevation changes that would force a pilot to gain altitude in a space where gaining altitude meant exposing yourself to every fighting position on the ridgelines. That's not a landing zone, she said. That's a kill box. It is now, Dahl agreed. But 6 months ago you put us in there anyway. Despite what the mission commander wanted, despite what your co-pilot was screaming over the radio. Dakota remembered, of course she remembered, that was the mission that had ended her career. Dahl must have seen something in her expression because his voice softened. The target we extracted that night just gave us intel on a high-value package. Same valley, needs to go in quiet, needs to come out fast. My team won't fly it with anyone else. We've briefed 3 pilots, all of them said it's impossible. He looked at her steadily. You've already done impossible, and you brought us all home. The room was silent except for the laboring air conditioner and the distant sound of a Chinook spooling up somewhere on the flight line. Dakota looked at the map, at the narrow tributary valley that had gotten her fired. She'd known, going in, that the approach violated doctrine. She'd known her co-pilot would file a complaint. She'd also known that the SEAL team on the ground was 30 seconds from being overrun, and the designated landing zone had just been lit up by RPG fire. So she'd flown into the tributary, squeezed the Black Hawk into a space that left 4 feet of clearance on each rotor tip, and held the bird steady while 6 men and a blindfolded detainee scrambled aboard. Her co-pilot had refused to fly with her again. The mission commander had included her decision in his after-action report, with language that implied recklessness. And Dakota had gone home to Emma without knowing whether she'd saved lives or just ruined her own career. Now looking at Dahl and his team, she had her answer. When do we fly? She asked. Dahl checked his watch. 16 hours. We go in at 0:30 full moon. You'll have 1 Black Hawk modified for high-altitude work. Your co-pilot is Lieutenant Sarah Chen, transferred in from the 160th. She's good, but she doesn't know the terrain. He paused. She also doesn't know why we requested you specifically. That's your call whether to tell her. Dakota nodded slowly. A new co-pilot meant building trust from scratch, in a time frame measured in hours instead of weeks. It also meant someone who hadn't been influenced by the rumors, who'd formed their own judgment based on what happened in the cockpit. I'll need to walk the aircraft, Dakota said. Need the full mission brief, weather forecast, and ingress route options. Also need to talk to your intel officer about what we're extracting. You'll have all of it by 1900, Dahl promised. He extended his hand. It's good to have you back, Widow. She shook his hand, feeling the calluses that came from fast roping and breaching doors and all the other violent work that SEALs did in the dark. Let's see if you still feel that way when we're in the valley, she said. The Black Hawk sat on the flight line like a sculpture of controlled violence, its rotor blades drooping slightly in the still air. Dakota walked around it slowly, checking panel access points and hydraulic lines with the kind of attention most people reserved for religious rituals. This particular aircraft had been modified. She could see the upgraded engine cowlings, the IR suppression system that wrapped around the exhaust, the mounting points for external fuel tanks. Someone had prepped this bird for a mission that would push every performance envelope. You must be Widow. Dakota turned. A woman in her late 20s stood a few feet away, flight suit crisp despite the heat, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Lieutenant Sarah Chen extended her hand with the kind of confidence that came from graduating top of your flight class. I'm your co-pilot, or you're mine, still figuring out the command structure on this one. Dakota shook her hand, nodding the firm grip and the directness in Chen's eyes. You've flown combat before. 18 months in Kandahar, mostly resupply and CASEVAC, some hot extractions, nothing like what they're briefing for this mission. Chen glanced at the Black Hawk. They tell me you know the gauntlet. I've flown it. And you put a bird into a valley that 3 other pilots just called unflyable. It wasn't quite a question. Dakota met Chen's gaze, trying to read whether that statement came from admiration or skepticism. I put a team in a space that had one viable approach. We made it work. Your co-pilot filed a complaint, said you ignored his calls to abort. So Chen had done her homework. Dakota appreciated that more than blind trust. He was right to be concerned. I made a judgment call. It worked out for the SEAL team. Didn't work out for my career. Chen was quiet for a moment, studying Dakota with an intensity that felt like assessment. I read the after-action report, all 3 versions. The SEAL commander said you displayed exceptional airmanship under fire. The mission commander said you demonstrated reckless disregard for crew safety. Your co-pilot said you showed inadequate crew resource management. All accurate depending on your priorities, Dakota said. So what are your priorities? Chen asked. Dakota looked at the Black Hawk at the mountains rising beyond the airfield perimeter. Getting everyone home, the team on the ground, the crew in the aircraft, and whatever package we're extracting. In that order. If you can't fly with those priorities, request a replacement. No judgment, no hard feelings, but decide now. Chen considered this for a long moment. Then she nodded. Let's pre-flight this bird. I want to know every system we're trusting our lives to. They spent the next hour going through the aircraft together, Chen asking questions that demonstrated real understanding of helicopter aerodynamics and combat operations. She'd clearly studied the Gauntlet mission profiles, had thoughts about approach angles and emergency egress routes. By the time they finished the external inspection, Dakota felt the first stirrings of trust. The mission brief started at 1900 in a SCIF buried beneath the operations center, one of those anonymous concrete rooms where America planned its secret wars. Dakota and Chen sat across from Dahl and his team, while a young intelligence officer clicked through satellite imagery on a battered laptop. Target designation Objective Copper, the officer began, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone who'd given this brief multiple times. High-value individual, Afghan national, claims to have information on a network facilitating cross-border weapons transfers. Our asset made contact 6 weeks ago, but his location has been compromised. He's requesting immediate extraction. The satellite image showed the tributary valley, the same impossible terrain Dakota had flown into 6 months ago. But the target location was different, deeper into the canyon system, in a village that clung to the hillside like a wasp's nest. Population, Dakota asked. Approximately 40 individuals, mostly extended family. The target is being sheltered by a cousin who served as an interpreter for coalition forces in the early years. That relationship is the only reason he's still alive. The officer clicked to the next slide, showing approach routes color-coded by threat level. Every single approach was marked red. Estimated enemy force strength is 15 to 20 fighters, mixed Taliban and foreign fighters with overlapping observation posts on the ridgelines. They know someone's hiding in that village. They just haven't been willing to level it yet because of tribal politics. How long does he have? Chen asked. Maybe 48 hours. There's been an uptick in nighttime movement around the village. They're preparing for something. Dahl leaned forward. The asset is worth the risk. His information has already led to 3 interdictions. If we can get him across the border, he can identify the entire logistics network. Dakota studied the satellite imagery, measuring distances and elevation changes in her head. The village sat at 7,200 feet, surrounded by ridgelines that climbed to over 10,000. The only approach was through the tributary canyon, flying beneath the elevation of the surrounding peaks, with no room for evasive maneuvers if they took fire. Weather, she asked. Clear skies, full moon. Temperature and density altitude will be marginal for hover performance, which meant they'd be flying at the absolute edge of the Black Hawk's capabilities in a space that offered no margin for error. Dakota looked at Chen, whose expression had gone very still. Thoughts? Chen studied the imagery for another moment. We'll need to shed weight wherever possible. Minimal fuel load, no door guns, reduced crew. Even then we'll be above max gross weight with the SEAL team and target aboard. Correct, Dakota said. She turned to Dahl. How many of your team are going in? 6 plus me. Make it 4. Every extra body costs us performance margin we don't have. Dahl's jaw tight. My team. Your team is excellent, but physics doesn't care about excellent. We'll be flying into a box canyon at density altitude, performing a hover at max power. I need every advantage I can get. The silence in the briefing room carried weight. Dakota could feel Chen watching her, measuring whether this was confidence or arrogance. The intelligence officer had stopped talking, waiting to see how a master sergeant would handle contradicting a SEAL team commander. Dahl stared at the map for a long moment. Then he nodded. 4 operators plus me. Who stays? The SEAL to his left, a compact man with the build of a middleweight fighter, spoke up. I stay. Better for you to have the medic and the heavy weapons specialist. Another SEAL nodded agreement. I'll sit this one. My daughter's birthday is in 3 days. Would rather not miss it. Just like that, the team reconfigured itself around the mission requirements. Dakota felt a grudging respect for these men, who could set aside ego and understand that getting the job done mattered more than individual glory. Landing zone options, she asked, looking at the intelligence officer. He zoomed in on the village. There's a flat area just south of the structures, maybe 50 feet in diameter. It's used for thrashing grain. That's your best option. Best was generous. 50 feet gave them maybe 10 feet of clearance on all sides, assuming perfect winds and no obstacles. Dakota had landed in tighter spaces, but never at 7,200 feet with a full combat load. Time on target. You'll have 5 minutes from wheels down to wheels up. Any longer and the enemy response will be coordinated. Right now, their observation posts are isolated from each other. Give them enough time to communicate and they'll have interlocking fires on your position. 5 minutes to land, secure the target and lift off, all while enemy fighters were scrambling to attack positions. The margins kept getting thinner. Chen cleared her throat. What's the backup plan if we take damage on the approach? The intelligence officer looked at Dahl, who looked at Dakota. There is no backup plan, Dakota said quietly. If we take significant damage in the valley, we'll be too low to auto-rotate to safe terrain. Best case, we crash land in the village and become a ground element that needs rescue. Worst case, we auger into the canyon wall. She let that reality settle over the room before continuing. That's why we're flying this mission with every advantage we can get. Lightweight, optimal power settings, perfect timing, and a crew that trusts each other completely. She looked at Chen. Can you fly right seat on this mission? Chen met her eyes. Yes. Even if it means going somewhere that breaks standard procedures. Standard procedures were written by people who never flew the gauntlet, Chen said. I'm good with making our own. Dakota felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite trust, not yet, but the beginning of partnership. They spent the next 6 hours preparing. Dakota walked the mission brief with Chen 3 times, sketching approach angles on a whiteboard and discussing emergency procedures, until both of them could recite power settings from memory. The Black Hawk received a final maintenance check, every system tested and retested by crew chiefs who understood what would happen if something failed at the wrong moment. Dahl's team staged their equipment, reducing every piece of gear to only what was absolutely necessary. By midnight, they'd stripped 30 pounds off the mission weight. By 0100, Dakota and Chen were in the cockpit, running pre-flight checks by the light of red LEDs that preserved their night vision. The familiar routine calmed Dakota's nerves, switches and gauges and procedures that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of flight time. Chen moved through the co-pilot's checklist with smooth efficiency, her hands steady on the controls. You ready for this? Dakota asked, as the engines began their startup sequence. Chen glanced over, her face illuminated by the instrument glow. Ask me when we're back on the ground. Fair enough. The Black Hawk lifted off at 0230, climbing into a night so clear that the stars seemed close enough to touch. The full moon hung over the mountains, turning the landscape into something from a fever dream, sharp shadows and silver light and peaks that looked like they'd been cut from obsidian. Dahl and his team sat in the cargo bay, quiet and professional, their weapons pointed down in a position of readiness that could shift to combat stance in seconds. They flew east toward the mountains, maintaining radio silence, navigating by GPS and Dakota's memory of terrain features that barely registered on the digital displays. At 20 miles out, Chen spoke over the intercom. Beginning our descent into the valley system. Dakota took control, feeling the Black Hawk respond to her inputs with the kind of precision that came from excellent maintenance and careful preparation. They dropped altitude, following a ridge line down into the main canyon. The walls rose on either side, moonlight painting them in shades of gray and black. This was the Gauntlet, the 60 miles of canyon that had earned its reputation one crashed helicopter at a time. Dakota flew it from memory, banking around obstacles that appeared suddenly in the shadows, feeling the aircraft's responses change as air pressure and temperature fluctuated through the winding passage. Behind them, Dahl's voice came through the intercom, calm and matter-of-fact. First checkpoint achieved. 30 minutes to target. 30 minutes of flying through a space where one mistake, one moment of inattention, would end with titanium and flesh scattered across rocks that had witnessed 1,000 years of warfare. Dakota felt hyper-alert, her awareness expanding to include every vibration of the airframe, every subtle change in engine tone. Beside her, Chen called out navigation points and watched the threat display. The tributary valley appeared exactly where Dakota remembered it, a dark wound splitting off from the main canyon, barely visible except as an absence of moonlight. She banked the Black Hawk into the turn, feeling the aircraft's weight as they descended into narrower confines. The walls closed in. 50 feet of clearance became 40, then 30. Chen's breathing changed rhythm on the intercom, faster but controlled. She was watching the radar altimeter and the terrain display, calling out distances that Dakota could also see but needed to hear confirmed. 20 feet port side clearance, 18 feet starboard. They were flying through a space barely wider than a residential street, at 120 knots in the dark, with 6 men and enough fuel to make a spectacular fireball if anything went wrong. Dakota's hands made constant small corrections, responding to downdrafts and turbulence that bounced the Black Hawk around like a toy. The village appeared ahead, a cluster of mud brick structures clinging to the hillside like something organic, grown rather than built. Dakota could see the thrashing ground, a flat circle of packed earth that looked impossibly small in the moonlight. Target area in sight, Chen announced. No visible enemy presence. Which didn't mean they weren't there, just that they hadn't started shooting yet. Dakota began the approach, bleeding off airspeed while managing the descent angle to keep them inside the narrow canyon. The Black Hawk's engines roared at high power settings, fighting the thin air and the aircraft's weight. At 50 feet, she pulled the nose up and transitioned to a hover, the aircraft shaking slightly as it balanced on thrust alone. The thrashing ground filled her forward vision, packed earth, a few scattered tools, and barely enough space for the main gear. "Coming down," Dakota said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The Black Hawk settled, and Dakota felt the main gear touch earth with a solid thump that transmitted through the airframe. "Wheels down," Chen confirmed. 3 minutes on the clock. In the cargo bay, Dahl and his team were already moving. Dakota watched in her peripheral vision as they flowed out the doors, their movements fast and practiced. They spread into a defensive perimeter around the Black Hawk while Dahl and 2 others sprinted toward the nearest structure. The night remained quiet except for the helicopter's engines and the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the village. 2 minutes. Chen's hands hovered over the controls, ready to take over if needed. Her eyes swept the surrounding ridgelines, watching for muzzle flashes or movement. 1 minute. Dahl's voice crackled over the radio. "Package secured. Moving to extract." Dakota saw them emerging from the shadows, 4 SEALs surrounding a thin Afghan man in traditional clothes who moved with the stiffness of someone injured or terrified. 30 seconds. The SEALs reached the Black Hawk, practically lifting the asset aboard. Everything went wrong in the space of a heartbeat. The first RPG came from the ridgeline to the north, a streak of fire that passed 20 feet over the Black Hawk's rotor disc and detonated against the canyon wall. The explosion lit the valley in harsh orange light, momentarily destroying Dakota's night vision. Before she could react, automatic weapons fire erupted from at least 3 positions, tracers painting red lines through the darkness toward the helicopter. Contact. Dahl's voice was sharp but controlled. Multiple positions, north and east ridgelines. We need to move now. Dakota's hands were already pulling collective, adding power to lift the Black Hawk out of the kill zone. The aircraft lurched upward, engines screaming at maximum output. Beside her, Chen was calling out threats and working the radio, taking fire from multiple positions, climbing through 500 feet. Rounds impacted the airframe with sounds like hammers on sheet metal. Dakota heard one of the SEALs in the back return fire, short controlled bursts that wouldn't help much but gave them something to do. She banked the Black Hawk hard to the left, trying to get the canyon wall between them and the shooters. The tributary valley that had been their approach route was now a gauntlet of enemy fire. She flew into it anyway, because the alternative was hovering in place while enemy fighters found their range. The walls closed in again, but now there were muzzle flashes on the ridgelines, fighters who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Dakota flew lower, using every dip and turn in the terrain to break line of sight, pushing the Black Hawk through maneuvers that made the low-rotor warning system blare. Chen had gone quiet, her hands mirroring Dakota's inputs on her own controls, ready to take over instantly if Dakota was hit. The trust in that silence was absolute. A second RPG launched from somewhere above them, but the shooter had led the target wrong and the rocket passed behind the Black Hawk's tail rotor, close enough that Dakota felt the aircraft shudder in the pressure wave. Hydraulic pressure dropping, Chen announced, her voice tight. Primary system down to 50%. Not catastrophic, not yet. But if they lost hydraulics entirely, the Black Hawk would become unflyable, the controls too heavy to muscle through the kind of aggressive maneuvering that was keeping them alive. Dakota adjusted her flying, trying to reduce the strain on the remaining system while still evading fire. They burst out of the tributary valley into the main canyon, and suddenly the threat board lit up like a Christmas tree. Enemy fighters had been moving along the ridgelines, anticipating their route. The gauntlet had become exactly what its name suggested, a 60-mile stretch where death waited at every turn. "Dahl," Dakota said into the radio, "I need to know about that package. Is he injured?" "Negative," Dahl replied. "Shaken but mobile." "Good. Tell everyone to strap in. This is going to get rough." Dakota pushed the Black Hawk to speeds that made every instinct scream at her to slow down. They flew through the gauntlet at 140 knots, which would have been reckless in daylight with full visibility. At night, with enemy fire tracking them and degraded hydraulics, it was something beyond reckless. It was the only choice that gave them a chance. The canyon walls were a blur of silver and shadow. Dakota navigated by feel as much as sight. Her awareness expanded to include the entire airframe, sensing changes in air pressure and turbulence that signaled upcoming terrain features. Beside her, Chen called out radar altimeter readings and navigation checkpoints, her voice never wavering despite the controlled violence of their flight. 100 feet AGL, bearing 355, checkpoint Delta in 30 seconds. An RPG came from a position directly ahead, the shooter timing it perfectly to catch them in a straight section of canyon. Dakota saw it launch, saw the smoke trail, and made a decision that existed beyond conscious thought. She hauled the Black Hawk into a maximum performance turn, so aggressive that the rotor system groaned in protest. The RPG passed through the space they'd occupied half a second earlier. The turn bled off airspeed they couldn't afford to lose. Dakota shoved the cyclic forward, diving toward the canyon floor to rebuild velocity. The low-altitude warning system screamed. They pulled out with less than 30 feet between the skids and the rocks, and Dakota was already climbing again, zigzagging through the canyon like a drunk driver. Behind them, Dahl's team maintained their professional silence, but Dakota could imagine what they were thinking. She was flying in a way that would get her court-martialed if anyone reviewed the flight recorder. She was also keeping them alive. The hydraulic pressure dropped further. 50% became 40, then 35. Dakota could feel the controls getting heavier, requiring more force to move. They were reaching the point where the backup systems wouldn't be enough. "Chen," she said quietly, "if we lose hydraulics entirely, I'll need you on the controls with me. Two of us might have enough strength to muscle it home." Understood, Chen replied. Her hands settled onto her control stick ready. 20 miles to go. The enemy fire had decreased as they left the most densely populated sections of the valley, but the hydraulic system continued to degrade. At 20%, it would fail entirely. They were at 25%. Dakota found herself talking to the Black Hawk, a quiet murmur under her breath that probably carried over the intercom, but she didn't care. Come on, baby, just a little further. You can make it. We all can make it. The canyon began to widen. They were approaching the eastern end of the gauntlet, where the terrain opened into foothills and eventually the flatlands near Jalalabad. Dakota held their altitude and speed, unwilling to change anything that was working. The hydraulic pressure stabilized at 22%, not improving but not failing completely. Dakota made a decision. We're going direct to Jalalabad. No scenic route, no tactical approach. I need to get this bird on the ground while we still have controls. Roger that, Chen said. She switched frequencies, calling the tower at Jalalabad and declaring an emergency. The controller's response was immediate, clearing all traffic and activating the crash response team. Dakota climbed above the ridgelines, trading the security of terrain masking for altitude that would give them options if the hydraulics failed. The Black Hawk rose into moonlight, away from the shadows where death had been hunting them. Behind her, Dahl spoke over the intercom. Hell of a flying, Widow, you got us out. We're not out yet, Dakota replied, but the worst was behind them. The Jalalabad airfield appeared ahead, a constellation of lights against the dark earth. Dakota began a straightened approach, flying the Black Hawk with exaggerated gentleness, trying not to stress the remaining hydraulic system. At 200 feet, Chen spoke again, her voice carefully neutral. We're trailing fluid, port side hydraulic line. Dakota glanced at her display panel. The pressure was dropping again, faster now, 20%, 18. They had maybe 60 seconds before the controls locked up entirely. Tower, this is Reaper 7-3. We are declaring a hydraulic emergency, landing immediately on the closest available surface. She didn't wait for a response. The numbers were simple. They had forward momentum, they had altitude, and they had about 30 seconds before the Black Hawk became a falling rock. Dakota aimed for the taxiway beside the main runway, a strip of asphalt that was wide enough and closer than the designated landing pads. At 50 feet, the hydraulic pressure hit 10% and the controls became almost immovable. Dakota and Chen both gripped their cyclic sticks, combining their strength to maintain control. The Black Hawk wallowed through the air like a wounded bird, barely responding to their inputs. 20 feet. Dakota pulled what little collective she could, trying to arrest their descent. The aircraft dropped like a stone, hit the taxiway hard enough to collapse the rear landing gear, and slid forward in a shower of sparks. Dakota's hands were already moving through the shutdown procedures, killing fuel flow and pulling circuit breakers, trying to prevent a fire that would kill everyone aboard. The Black Hawk came to rest at an angle, its tail section crumpled, its nose pointing toward the stars. Everybody out, Dahl ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. His team was already moving, dragging the asset and their equipment clear of the wreckage. Dakota remained in her seat, finishing the emergency shutdown, making sure the aircraft was safe before she abandoned it. Beside her, Chen's hands shook on the controls. The crash response team arrived within 90 seconds, firefighters in silver suits surrounding the Black Hawk with foam and equipment. Dakota climbed out through the pilot's door, her legs unsteady, and found Dahl waiting on the taxiway. "Everyone okay?" she asked. "Bruises and adrenaline dumps, nothing serious." He looked at the Black Hawk, at the collapsed landing gear and the trail of hydraulic fluid marking their landing. "You brought us home." "I crashed us home," Dakota corrected. But she understood what he meant. They were alive, the asset was secure, and the mission was complete. That counted for more than a damaged helicopter. Chen joined them, pulling off her helmet. Her hair was plastered to her head with sweat and her flight suit was dark with it. "I need a drink," she said. "Or a therapist, maybe both." "You flew well," Dakota told her. "Especially when the hydraulics went. Having you on the controls made the difference." Chen looked at her for a long moment. "How many times have you done something like that?" "You mean controlled crashes after losing systems while being shot at?" Yeah, tonight makes three, Dahl laughed, a sound that carried equal parts relief and exhaustion. And that's why we requested you specifically. Nobody else would have gotten us out of that valley. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Dakota watched the light spread across the fob, warming the mud-brown buildings and the rows of parked aircraft. Emma would be waking up in Nebraska right now, getting ready for school. Dakota made a mental note to call her later, to tell her that Mommy's deployment was going well, that everything was fine. It wasn't a complete lie. She'd crashed a helicopter, probably violated a dozen regulations, and was definitely going to spend the next week answering questions from safety officers. But she'd also brought 7 people home from a place where most pilots wouldn't have gone at all. That felt like a victory, even if the paperwork wouldn't reflect it. An officer approached, a major whose name tape read Harrison. He looked at the damaged Black Hawk, then at Dakota, and his expression suggested he was already composing the incident report in his head. Master Sergeant Reeves, I'm going to need a statement about what happened tonight. Yes, sir, Dakota said. I'll have a full report ready by this afternoon. Harrison nodded slowly. I've already received 3 calls from higher headquarters asking about this mission. Sounds like there's a lot of interest in how it played out, which could mean trouble or commendation, depending on who was asking. Dakota had learned to stop trying to predict which way things would go. She focused on what she could control: the flying, the decisions in the cockpit, the safety of her crew and passengers. They debriefed in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and stress sweat, going through every moment of the mission with intelligence officers who took notes and asked careful questions. Dahl and his team provided their perspective from the cargo bay, describing the enemy positions and the timing of the ambush. Chen walked through the technical details of the hydraulic failure, showing the point where primary systems degraded and backup systems became insufficient. When it was Dakota's turn, she stuck to facts. Altitude, airspeed, power settings, and decisions made under fire. She didn't try to justify the aggressive flying or the emergency landing. The data would speak for itself. Major Harrison listened without interruption. When Dakota finished, he set down his pen and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Master Sergeant, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Do you believe you violated any regulations during this mission? Dakota considered her answer carefully. I believe I made decisions that prioritized crew survival over aircraft preservation. Some of those decisions pushed the boundaries of accepted operating procedures. I'd make the same decisions again in the same circumstances. Harrison nodded. That's an honest answer. You'll be pleased to know that Lieutenant Commander Dalton has already submitted a recommendation that you receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions. He's also requested that you be restored to full flight status and assigned to his task force permanently. The words took a moment to process. Distinguished Flying Cross, full flight status, permanent assignment to a SEAL task force. These were outcomes Dakota hadn't dared to hope for during her 6 months of administrative exile. Sir, I'm honored, but what about the investigation, the complaints from my last mission? Those complaints have been reviewed and dismissed. The final determination was that you demonstrated sound judgment under combat conditions. Your previous mission commander has submitted revised statements acknowledging that his initial report was incomplete. Harrison stood, gathering his notes. You're back on flight status effective immediately. We'll need you for another mission in 72 hours, similar profile to tonight's operation. Lieutenant Chen has volunteered to remain as your co-pilot. After Harrison left, Dakota sat alone in the conference room, trying to process the sudden reversal of fortune. 6 months ago, she'd been facing the end of her military career. Now she was being commended for the exact same kind of flying that had gotten her fired. The truth was simpler than the paperwork suggested. Results mattered. She'd brought men home from places where they'd expected to die. That counted for more than complaints or procedures, or the opinions of people who made decisions from the safety of headquarters. Chen found her an hour later, sitting on the edge of the taxiway and watching maintenance crews begin the process of repairing the damaged Black Hawk. The aircraft looked worse in daylight: crumpled tail section, collapsed landing gear, scorch marks from the hard landing. But the airframe was intact. The critical systems were salvageable. It would fly again. "Heard about the medal recommendation," Chen said, sitting down beside her. "That's impressive." "Heard you volunteered to keep flying with me," Dakota replied. "That's either impressive or crazy. Haven't decided which." Chen smiled. "Probably both, but I learned more in one mission with you than I learned in 18 months of standard operations. If I'm going to fly combat, I want to fly with someone who knows how to survive it." They sat in companionable silence, watching the maintenance crews work. Finally, Chen spoke again. "Can I ask about your call sign?" "Widow." "That's not a standard call sign. There's a story there." Dakota had known this question would come eventually. Call signs were earned, not chosen, and the memorable ones always had backstory. "My husband was a ranger," she said quietly. "Killed in Helmand Province 7 years ago. We had a 6-month-old daughter. I stayed in the army, kept flying, and somewhere along the way someone started calling me widow. It stuck." "I'm sorry," Chen said. "Don't be. He died doing what he believed in. I'm raising our daughter to understand that service matters, and I'm flying missions that would have made him proud." She paused, then added, "That's why I take risks that scare other pilots. I've already lost the most important person in my life. The thought of losing a team member because I played it safe when I could have done something more, that's not a fear I can live with." Chen nodded slowly. "That explains a lot about last night, about the tributary valley and the way you flew through the gauntlet." "It also explains why I was under investigation," Dakota said. "Not everyone understands the distinction between reckless and aggressive. My last co-pilot saw me as someone who took unnecessary chances. He wasn't completely wrong. I do take chances, but I calculate them, plan for them, prepare for them. Every risk has a reason." "And what's the reason for agreeing to fly another mission in 72 hours?" "Same reason as the last one," Dakota said. "There are people who need extraction, and we're the ones with the skill to do it. That's the job." The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning coolness and replacing it with the dry heat that characterized Afghanistan's spring. Dakota stood, brushing dust off her flight suit. "I need to call my daughter. Then I need about 12 hours of sleep. After that, we start planning the next mission." Chen stood as well. "Want company for the planning?" "I've got some thoughts about approach routes that might improve our margins." The call with Emma happened via satellite phone in a calm tent that offered minimal privacy. Dakota sat on a folding chair, pressing the phone against her ear, and listened to her daughter's voice talk about school projects and soccer practice and all the normal concerns of an 8-year-old. "How's work, Mommy?" Emma asked, in that careful way that suggested she knew some things weren't supposed to be discussed. "It's good, sweetheart. I helped some people today. Did some flying." "Did you crash?" The question was innocent, but it hit harder than Emma could know. Dakota had been careful to shield her daughter from the realities of combat aviation, from the crashes and casualties and close calls that define the profession. "Not exactly," Dakota said, "but we had to land kind of hard. The helicopter is okay. Everyone is okay." "That's good. Mrs. Peterson says you're a hero. She saw something on the news about the Army rescuing someone." Dakota felt a chill. If the mission was already on the news, that meant someone had leaked operational details, which meant security protocols had failed somewhere. "Mrs. Peterson shouldn't believe everything on the news," Dakota said carefully. "But I appreciate her support. How are you doing with reading?" They talked for another 15 minutes about books and homework and the normal rhythms of life that seemed impossibly distant from the compound in Jalalabad. When Emma finally said goodbye, Dakota sat for a long time with the dead phone in her hand, thinking about the different worlds she inhabited. At home, she was a single mother navigating parent-teacher conferences and grocery shopping. Here, she was a pilot who flew into places that didn't appear on maps, extracting assets whose names she'd never learn. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Sleep came in a plywood barracks that housed transient aircrew, on a cot that was marginally more comfortable than the ground. Dakota dreamed about the tributary valley, about walls closing in and hydraulics failing and the sound of rounds hitting the airframe. She woke up gasping, soaked in sweat, and checked her watch. 4 hours of sleep. It would have to be enough. The operations center was busy with the controlled chaos of a forward base running continuous missions. Dakota found Chen already there, studying satellite imagery on a laptop. New target, Chen said by way of greeting. Similar profile to last night, but the terrain is different. It's not the gauntlet. She pulled up a map showing a river valley in a different province, terrain that was less vertical but more open. SEAL Team 7 has another asset ready for extraction. This one is time-sensitive, 48 hours maximum. But the approach is complicated because we'll be overflying populated areas. Higher chance of being observed, possibly engaged. Dakota studied the imagery, measuring distances and identifying terrain features that could provide cover or concealment. What's the package? Chen pulled up a file with photos and details about the asset, a Taliban commander who defected, claiming knowledge of planned attacks against coalition forces. He was being sheltered by family members in a village 40 miles from the nearest American outpost, too far for ground extraction, too exposed for a daytime operation. He'll be ready at a specific grid coordinate, Chen explained. We'll have a 30-minute window to reach him, pick him up, and get clear. Miss the window and he goes back into hiding. After that, we might not get another chance. Dakota nodded, already thinking through contingencies. What's the threat environment? Mixed. Local security forces are friendly, but there are insurgent elements that operate in the area. Intel suggests we'll face small arms fire during extraction, possibly RPGs. No heavy weapons confirmed. So basically identical to last night's mission, just with different geography. Essentially, yes. Dakota looked at Chen, seeing the tension in her shoulders, the careful control of her expression. You okay flying another high-risk mission this soon? Chen met her eyes. Honestly, no. I spent most of today replaying everything that went wrong last night, all the moments where we could have died. But I also know that if we don't fly this mission, someone else will. Someone with less experience in this terrain, less capability. So yeah, I'm okay flying it. I'm just not pretending it doesn't scare me. Good, Dakota said. The day this stops scaring you is the day you start making mistakes. Fear keeps you sharp, as long as you don't let it control your decisions. They spent the next 8 hours planning, going through approach routes and emergency procedures with Dahl and his team. This time, Dahl brought only 4 operators total, keeping the weight down based on Dakota's recommendations from the previous mission. By the time they finished planning, Dakota felt confident they could execute the mission. She also felt the weight of another high-risk operation settling onto her shoulders. 2 missions in 72 hours, both pushing the limits of aircraft capability and crew skill. This was the tempo that defined special operations, sustained high-intensity work that ground down people and equipment until something broke. Dakota was determined that the breaking point wouldn't happen on her watch. They launched at 0300, the Black Hawk cutting through darkness toward the river valley. This aircraft was different from the one they'd crashed, newer, with updated avionics and no history of hydraulic problems. Dakota trusted it cautiously, the way you'd trust a horse you'd never ridden before. The flight plan took them over mountains and desert, following a route designed to minimize exposure to populated areas. They flew low and fast, using terrain masking to avoid radar detection. At 20 minutes out, Dahl's voice came through the intercom. Package confirms he's ready. Grid coordinates match our planned pickup point. We're green for extraction. The village appeared exactly where Intel had promised. A collection of mud brick compounds arranged around a central courtyard, situated in a bend of the river that gave them natural protection on 3 sides. Dakota circled once at altitude, scanning for threats, then committed to the approach. They descended fast, trading altitude for speed, and flared hard over the pickup point. The landing zone was a flat area beside the river, soft sand that would make hovering more difficult, but was large enough to accommodate the Black Hawk's rotor span. Dakota held the hover at 5 feet, not wanting to set the skids down in sand that might shift. Dahl and his team deployed ropes, preparing for a fast rope extraction if the asset couldn't make it to the aircraft. But the man appeared immediately, running from one of the compounds with another figure beside him, presumably the family member who'd sheltered him. Dakota watched through her night vision as the asset reached the Black Hawk, and Dahl's team pulled him aboard. The operation was clean, professional, exactly how it was supposed to work. Then the shooting started. Muzzle flashes erupted from multiple compounds, automatic weapons fire that tore through the night. Dakota felt impacts against the airframe, heard the distinctive crack of rounds passing close. She pulled collective immediately, lifting the Black Hawk out of the kill zone while Chen called out threats and worked the radio. Multiple shooters, ground level and rooftops, taking fire from 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock. One of Dahl's team returned fire from the open door, controlled bursts that forced the shooters to take cover. Dakota banked hard, trying to get terrain between them and the village, but the river valley was too open. They were exposed. An RPG launched from a rooftop position, and Dakota saw it coming with the kind of crystal clarity that came from pure adrenaline. She kicked the tail rotor hard, spinning the Black Hawk 90 degrees while maintaining forward momentum. The maneuver was violent enough to slam everyone against their restraints, but it worked. The RPG passed through empty air where they would have been, detonating harmlessly against the far bank of the river. Jesus Christ, Chen breathed. That was too close. Dakota didn't answer. She was busy flying them out of the valley, gaining altitude and distance, checking systems to ensure nothing critical had been damaged. The Black Hawk responded normally, no warning lights, no indication of damage beyond the holes she could hear air whistling through. "Status check," Dahl ordered over the intercom. His team called out confirmations. Everyone was okay. The asset was secure, minimal equipment damage. They'd gotten lucky again. The flight back to Jalalabad was tense, everyone waiting for delayed failures or secondary problems. But the Black Hawk flew true, and they landed without incident as the sun broke over the eastern horizon. This time there was no crash, no emergency. Just a successful mission that would become another line in someone's report, another data point in the ongoing war. Major Harrison met them on the flight line, and his expression suggested news that could go either way. "Master Sergeant Reeves, Lieutenant Chen, good work tonight. The asset is already in debrief, providing valuable intelligence." He paused, and Dakota braced for whatever came next. "I've received orders from SOCOM headquarters. They're creating a dedicated aviation detachment to support SEAL Team 7's operations in this area. They want you to lead it with Chen as your deputy. You'll have 2 Black Hawks, dedicated maintenance support and operational authority to plan and execute missions without normal approval chains." Dakota felt Chen's eyes on her but kept her focus on Harrison. "Sir, that's a significant command responsibility for a master sergeant. You'd be promoted to sergeant major, effective immediately. The position requires someone with your experience and judgment. SOCOM believes you're the right person." It was the kind of career opportunity that didn't come along often: significant responsibility, autonomy, and the chance to shape how special operations aviation was conducted. It was also the kind of position that would consume every waking hour, would keep her deployed for extended periods, would mean missing more of Emma's childhood. "Can I have 24 hours to consider?" Dakota asked. Harrison nodded. "Of course. But I should mention that Lieutenant Commander Dalton has already submitted a request that his team operate exclusively with your detachment. He stated that your crew is the most capable aviation asset he's worked with in 15 years of special operations. That's high praise." After Harrison left, Dakota and Chen walked to the mess hall, neither of them speaking until they had coffee in a quiet corner away from the morning crowd. "Are you going to take it?" Chen asked. Dakota wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, feeling its warmth. "I don't know. It's everything I should want: advancement, responsibility, the chance to do meaningful work. But it's also everything that scares me as a parent. More deployments, more time away from Emma, more missions where I might not come home." "What would your husband say?" Chen's question was gentle, not pushing. Dakota thought about it, remembering conversations they'd had before his final deployment. "He'd say that service requires sacrifice, that our daughter would grow up understanding the importance of doing hard things for the right reasons. He'd also say that I shouldn't let fear make my decisions." Sounds like a wise man. He was, But he also had the luxury of knowing that if he didn't come home, I'd be there to raise Emma. I don't have that safety net. If something happens to me, she goes into foster care. My parents are gone, his parents are too old to raise a child. It's just us. Chen was quiet for a moment. I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you that flying with you has been the most professionally rewarding experience of my military career. You've taught me more about combat aviation in 2 missions than I learned in 2 years of standard operations. If you take this position, I'll follow you, and I'll do everything I can to help you get home to your daughter after every mission. Dakota spent the day thinking, walking the perimeter of the base while fighter jets took off and transport planes delivered supplies. The war continued its rhythm, indifferent to individual decisions. By evening, she'd made her choice. She found Emma's photo in her wallet, a school picture from last year, showing a gap-toothed smile and eyes that carried her father's determination. Dakota had saved 17 people across her last 2 missions. The detachment would give her the chance to save more, to perfect the methods and techniques that made impossible missions survivable. That mattered, but Emma mattered more. Dakota called Major Harrison and declined the position. She recommended Chen for the role instead, with herself as senior advisor. It was a compromise. She'd remain involved in high-risk operations but wouldn't carry the command responsibility that required constant deployment. Harrison accepted her decision without argument, and within 24 hours, Chen was promoted to captain and given command of the new detachment. Dakota remained her senior pilot, the person who flew the most difficult missions and trained others to survive them. The arrangement worked. Over the next 6 months, they executed 14 missions, each one pushing the boundaries of what people thought possible with a helicopter and skilled crew. They developed new techniques for terrain flying, emergency procedures, and crew resource management. Other pilots rotated through the detachment, learning from Dakota's experience and Chen's leadership. The reputation of their unit spread through special operations channels. When teams needed aviation support for operations that seemed impossible, they requested Dakota's detachment. Not because she took unnecessary risks, but because she calculated necessary ones better than anyone else. The Distinguished Flying Cross came through official channels, presented at a ceremony that Dakota attended in dress uniform with Emma beside her. The citation mentioned exceptional flying skill and sound judgment under fire. It didn't mention the crashes or the close calls or the moments of pure terror. Those remained in Dakota's memory, shaping how she flew and what she taught others. On her last day in Afghanistan before rotating back to the States, Dahl found her on the flight line, watching the sun set over mountains that had tried very hard to kill her. "You made a difference here," he said simply. "My team is alive because of your flying. Other teams are alive because you trained their pilots. That matters." "It was a team effort," Dakota replied. "You know it was more than that. You set a standard that others will try to match for years." They stood in silence, watching light fade from the peaks. Somewhere out there, other pilots were flying into valleys with names like Gauntlet and Ghost. Some of them had trained with Dakota, learned her techniques, absorbed her philosophy of aggressive competence tempered with calculated risk. That legacy would continue long after she went home to Nebraska and resumed being a full-time mother. "Take care of Chen," Dakota said finally. "She's going to be an exceptional commander." "Already is," Dahl agreed. The flight home felt longer than the deployment, all those hours compressed into metal tubes crossing oceans and continents. Dakota slept fitfully, dreaming about mountains and hydraulic failures and the sound of Emma's voice asking if Mommy had crashed. When she finally walked off the plane in Nebraska, Emma was waiting with Dakota's parents and a sign that read, "Welcome home, hero mom." The hug lasted long enough that Dakota felt the deployment's tension begin to drain away, replaced by the simple reality of holding her daughter safe in her arms. Life resumed its normal patterns, school runs and grocery shopping and parent-teacher conferences. But Dakota carried Afghanistan with her in ways both visible and hidden. The Distinguished Flying Cross sat in a shadow box on her bedroom wall. The nightmares came less frequently but never stopped entirely. And every time she heard a helicopter overhead, she'd pause and look up, remembering what it felt like to fly through places where the sky was a battleground. The reserve unit welcomed her back, assigning her to training duties where she could pass along hard-won knowledge to younger pilots. She taught courses on mountain flying and emergency procedures, using sanitized versions of her combat experience to illustrate principles that might save lives. Some of her students were talented, some were merely competent, but all of them learned that there was a difference between following procedures and understanding why those procedures existed. 6 months after returning home, Dakota received a package from Chen. Inside was a photo of the aviation detachment, 2 Black Hawks and their crews, standing in front of the aircraft with the kind of casual confidence that came from repeated success. Chen had written on the back, 14 missions, 0 casualties, countless lives saved. Thank you for showing us what's possible. Also in the package was a flight suit patch, unofficial, unauthorized, exactly the kind of thing that special operations units created to build identity. It showed a black widow spider against a mountain silhouette, with the words "Widow's Flight" curved above. Dakota held the patch for a long time, remembering the missions and the people and the moments where everything had hung in the balance. She'd made the right choice, declining command to focus on Emma, but she'd also made an impact that would outlive her active duty career. That felt like enough. Emma found her sitting in the bedroom, holding the patch and the photo. "What's that, Mom?" "A reminder," Dakota said. "Of what?" "That sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. And that the people we save are worth whatever risks we take." Emma climbed onto the bed beside her, studying the photo with serious eyes. "Mrs. Peterson says you're famous now, that other pilots talk about you." "Mrs. Peterson talks too much," Dakota said, but she smiled. "I'm not famous. I'm just someone who did her job in places where the job was hard." "Are you going back?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Emma was old enough now to understand deployment, separation, risk. Dakota pulled her close. "Not for a long time. Right now, my most important job is being your mom." They sat together as evening light filled the room, a mother and daughter in Nebraska, far from mountains and combat and the places where helicopters earned their names. But Dakota knew the valleys would always be part of her, shaping who she was and what she taught, and how she understood the relationship between risk and duty. The next generation of pilots would fly into those valleys, carrying techniques she'd developed and philosophies she'd refined through trial and terror. Some of them would survive missions they shouldn't have, because Dakota had shown them how. That legacy, measured in lives saved, and missions accomplished and impossible things made routine, was the real medal, the one that didn't come with ceremonies or official recognition. It lived in the quiet competence of pilots who flew into darkness and brought their people home. Years later, when historians wrote about special operations aviation in Afghanistan, they'd mention the Gauntlet and the tributary valleys, and the missions that pushed Black Hawks beyond their documented capabilities. Some would note the crashed helicopters and the close calls. The best historians would understand that the crashes were never the point. The point was that everyone walked away, that the missions succeeded despite the odds, that pilots like Dakota Reeves had raised the bar for what possible meant in the most difficult flying conditions on Earth. But on that evening in Nebraska, with her daughter warm against her side, Dakota wasn't thinking about history or legacy. She was thinking about the next day, about soccer practice and homework, and the 100 small moments that made up a life worth living. The mountains would always be there, testing new generations of pilots. Dakota had done her part. Now it was someone else's turn to fly into the valleys where helicopters weren't supposed to go, and prove that skill and courage and careful judgment could overcome any obstacle. The story of Widow's Flight would continue without her, carried forward by pilots who'd learned that impossible was just another word for difficult, and difficult was just another challenge to master. That was enough. That was everything.